It was my third year of university when I, along with my 3 roommates, James, Tom, and Mark, decided to move out of the school dormitory and rent an apartment off campus. At first, it was simply for the sake of more freedom, escaping the cramped living conditions and strict rules of the dorm. Little did we know, that decision would lead us into something far darker than we could have imagined. We were a diverse group, personality-wise. James was outgoing and a cheerful person, always finding ways to lift everyone's spirits. Tom was quieter, preferring weekends spent reading or gaming in his room. Mark, however, was the quietest among us, almost reclusive, rarely talking to strangers. Yet we all considered him a close friend. As for me, I liked sticking to a plan, avoiding trouble wherever I could. Mark, in particular, had always been a man of few words. His mind seemed elsewhere most of the time, and though he would occasionally join us for drinks, he always appeared distant. He was probably socially anxious, always avoiding large groups. We'd often joke that Mark was our quiet philosopher, to which he'd just give a small, reserved smile without saying much. When we decided to move out of the dorms, Mark was initially reluctant. He didn't seem eager to change his routine. However, he eventually agreed, probably not wanting to be left out. We found an old apartment building near the university, dilapidated but affordable. This building stood at the end of a quiet alley, its worn-out facade showing decades of neglect. The walls were covered in grime, and dust thickly coated the windows. A dim orange light flickered from the hallway, adding an eerie feel to the place. "Is this really our new home?" James scoffed, dragging his suitcase while glancing around in disbelief. "At least the rent is cheap," Tom replied pragmatically. He wasn't one to care much about appearances, as long as we saved money. Mark said nothing, standing behind us with his head down, staring at his shoes. He had been the most resistant to moving out of the dorms and now seemed even more withdrawn. Yet, he followed us silently without voicing his opinion. I scanned the area, feeling an unsettling sensation. The whole building seemed forgotten by time, standing in the alley as if it didn't belong to the rest of the world. The small garden out front was overgrown with weeds, and the stone walkway was cracked and uneven from years of weathering. "Let's see the inside before we judge it too much," I suggested, trying to break the tension. Dragging our luggage, we walked into the building. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting shadows that danced on the dirty walls. The air was thick with a musty, almost rotting smell that made my stomach turn. "This place gives me the creeps," James muttered under his breath. The staircase was covered with old carpet, and as we stepped on it, the floorboards creaked ominously, making it feel like the whole place could collapse at any moment. By the time we reached the 5th floor, the moldy smell had intensified. I had to hold my breath just to avoid gagging. "Think this place is gonna fall apart?" Tom joked, but I could hear the edge in his voice. At the top of the stairs, there was another set leading up to the 6th floor, but it was sealed off with a rusty chain and a heavy lock, as though no one had been there in years. I frowned, curiosity stirring. "What's up there?" I asked, pointing toward the chained-off stairs. At that moment, Bennett, our landlord, appeared behind us. He was a man in his 50s with dark, weathered skin and deep lines across his face, his eyes sharp and cold. "The 6th floor is off-limits. It's an old attic. No one lives up there," he said, his gravelly voice leaving no room for debate. We exchanged glances but didn't press further. After all, we were just renters, and it wasn't our place to pry into the building's past. Mark, as usual, stayed silent, looking down at his feet as though he wasn't part of the conversation. Inside the apartment, the space was bigger than our dorm rooms, though the furniture was old and covered in cobwebs. The ceiling had an ancient, dusty chandelier that barely gave off enough light, adding to the place's gloomy atmosphere. James and I shared a room near the kitchen, while Tom and Mark took the other room by the living room. The mattresses looked old, stained with age, but it was still better than the cramped bunk beds we had in the dorms. After unpacking, the sun had already set. James suggested we head to a nearby bar to celebrate moving in, and I agreed. Tom and Mark, however, looked too exhausted to join us. "You guys go ahead. I'm gonna get some sleep," Mark mumbled, his voice heavy with fatigue. After a few hours at the bar, we returned to the apartment, the streets eerily quiet, with only a few streetlights illuminating the way. Inside, the building felt even more unsettling at night. The moldy smell seemed stronger, and the flickering lights in the hallway created moving shadows that made me uneasy. I got ready for bed, but as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I suddenly heard a sharp, piercing sound. A cat's meow. It was loud and shrill, cutting through the silence of the night. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway, close but impossible to pinpoint. I sat up, ears straining to hear more. The meowing continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, like it was moving around the building. "Did you hear that?" Mark's voice came from the darkness of our room, low and filled with fear. He had clearly been woken up by the noise as well. I didn't answer, too focused on the strange sound. The meowing was unnatural, not just the typical stray cat sound. It carried a strange, chilling tone. A feeling of unease settled over me, as if that cat wasn't just a coincidence. Something was very wrong. That night, sleep eluded me. The cat's cries haunted me, echoing faintly in the silence. I had the creeping suspicion that this building held secrets, and that strange meowing was only the beginning. The first night in our new apartment had been normal enough. After coming back from the bar, we all went to bed, ready to put the day behind us. However, not long after lying down, the sharp, eerie meowing began again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. The sound echoed down the hallway, high-pitched and almost mournful. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl. "You hear that?" Mark's voice whispered again from across the room, sounding more nervous than before. "It's probably just a stray cat outside," I replied, trying to calm myself as much as him. After all, hearing a cat at night wasn't that unusual in a city. But this was different. The meowing continued, echoing up and down the hallway as if the cat was pacing back and forth. Mark seemed especially sensitive to it, fidgeting in his bed. He got up, walking to the window to peer outside. "The cat's in the hallway," Mark said quietly, his tone uneasy. I followed him to the window, but all I could see was darkness. The hallway light flickered, casting everything in a dim, eerie glow. The meowing persisted, growing more erratic and unsettling. I felt a chill run through me. Over the next few days, the cat's cries became more frequent, especially late at night. Mark's reaction grew worse each time, and it seemed to get under his skin in a way that none of us could understand. He started becoming more anxious, his eyes darting to the door at the faintest sound. "It's watching us," he muttered one night, sitting on the couch, his voice trembling slightly. His face had paled, and he looked more exhausted by the day. "You're overthinking it," I tried to reassure him, though I was beginning to worry myself. James, ever the joker, didn't take it seriously. "It's just a cat looking for food. No big deal." But Mark wasn't convinced. The more the meowing echoed through the nights, the more agitated he became. His sleep was increasingly disturbed, and he started having vivid nightmares. We would hear him thrashing in his bed, gasping for breath, as though something was chasing him in his dreams. One night, James and I returned from a late-night grocery run, and there it was, the black cat. It sat perched at the staircase between the 5th and 6th floors, its fur jet black and its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Around its neck was a red bow, its brightness stark against the cat's dark fur. "Looks like we found our noisy neighbor," James joked, though his tone had an edge of unease. The cat didn't move. It just sat there, staring at us with unblinking eyes, its gaze cold and unsettling. We hurried past it, not wanting to engage, but the image of its piercing eyes stayed with me long after we closed the apartment door behind us. The next few nights, the black cat appeared more frequently, and its presence seemed to bring a strange heaviness to the air. Mark's reactions became more extreme. Every time he saw the cat, his face would twist in fear, as though the sight of it confirmed some unspoken dread. "It's not a normal cat," Mark said one night, his voice shaking. "It's watching us, watching me." We tried to calm him down, but we were all starting to feel the weight of the situation. The oppressive atmosphere that seemed to settle over the building with each passing night made us feel like we were all being watched, as if the cat's presence was just the beginning of something far darker. As time passed, Mark's behavior became more erratic. At first, it was just restlessness, but soon it grew into something more disturbing. He became quieter, more withdrawn. His eyes often looked hollow, like he was lost in his own thoughts. Whenever the cat's meows started in the night, Mark's anxiety would spike, and he'd begin pacing the apartment like a caged animal. The cat seemed to have become a nightmare for him. Every time it cried out, Mark would tense up, sometimes staying awake for the entire night, unable to calm down. He started having severe nightmares, often waking up drenched in sweat, muttering about the cat following him even in his dreams. "It's here watching me," he whispered one morning, sitting at the kitchen table, his voice hoarse. We sat across from him, exchanging worried looks. Mark was becoming more unstable by the day. "What are you talking about?" James asked, putting down his coffee cup, his concern evident. "The cat is not just a stray. It's watching me, following me. Even in my dreams," Mark replied, his voice trembling. Tom frowned, leaning back in his chair, his face lined with confusion and concern. "You sure it's not just stress? It's just a cat after all?" Mark didn't respond, his gaze distant. Since we had moved in, he had become increasingly difficult to reach. He no longer joined us for meals or conversations, and whenever I passed by his room, I'd hear him talking softly to himself, the word cat often slipping through the murmurs. More disturbingly, Mark had started acting out in his sleep. We'd hear him wandering the apartment at night, muttering incomprehensible things. One night, I got up to use the bathroom and found him standing in the living room, staring blankly out the window. His face was pale, his eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. "Mark, what are you doing?" I asked softly, trying not to startle him. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. He just stood there, gazing out the window with a vacant expression. A chill ran down my spine. Then I heard it again. The cat's meow, sharp and eerie, echoing from the hallway. Mark suddenly turned to me, his face contorted in fear. He grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "It's out there. It's watching us," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide and filled with terror. My heart raced as I tried to calm him down. I knew Mark was spiraling, and I had to get him out of this state before things got worse. "Let's talk about this tomorrow, okay? Get some rest for now," I said, trying to sound as soothing as possible. But Mark didn't let go. His face twisted with pain, as though he was struggling with something beyond his control. "You don't understand. It's controlling me. I can't stop hearing it," Mark muttered, his voice trembling with fear. I looked into his bloodshot eyes and felt a growing sense of dread. Mark was clearly experiencing something none of us could comprehend, and whatever it was tearing him apart. The next morning, we all gathered in the kitchen to discuss Mark's condition. James and Tom were just as worried as I was, though none of us wanted to admit how bad things had gotten. Mark was being affected by something unseen, something we couldn't stop. He was standing in the living room last night, just staring out the window like a zombie. I told them, my voice heavy with concern. "He's sleepwalking. It's like he's in some kind of trance," James added, his face pale with worry. Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe we should take him to see a doctor," but it wasn't that simple. Mark refused any help, his behavior becoming more erratic by the day. Whenever we tried to talk to him, he'd lash out in anger, shouting at us to leave him alone. His eyes grew darker, his expression more sinister. Worst of all, he began sleepwalking more frequently. We'd hear him moving through the apartment at night, talking to something or someone unseen. Sometimes, he'd wake us with his eerie laughter, as though something was amusing him in his dreamlike state. One night, I was jolted awake by a low murmur coming from the living room. I crept out of bed to find Mark standing there, his eyes closed, holding a kitchen knife. He was swinging it clumsily through the air, muttering under his breath. "Mark, put the knife down." "What are you doing?" I said, my voice shaking with fear. His eyes snapped open, hollow and lifeless, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "It told me I had to do it," Mark whispered, his voice unsettlingly calm. A chill ran down my spine. Mark was no longer in control of his actions, and it was becoming clear that something far more sinister was at play. We didn't know what was happening to him, but we knew one thing for sure. Mark was being consumed by a dark force, one we couldn't see or fight. Things reached their breaking point one night. It was eerily quiet, with no wind and no moon, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to smother everything. The air in the apartment was thick with tension, and we all felt it, though no one dared to speak. Mark's condition had worsened to the point where he barely spoke, his eyes hollow and haunted. Each night, the cat's cries seemed to intensify, and with it, Mark's agitation. That night, the cat's meow was louder than ever before. It sounded amplified, as if it were coming from all around us, echoing through the walls. Mark suddenly stood up, his face twisted with rage and fear, his eyes locked on the door. "I can't take it anymore," Mark screamed, his voice shrill with desperation. He grabbed a chair and threw it to the ground, his breathing ragged as if he had finally snapped. James jumped up, trying to calm him down. "Mark, relax. It's just a cat. We can talk to the landlord." But Mark was beyond reason. He shoved James aside and bolted for the door, his eyes wild with fury. "I'm going to kill it. I'm ending this tonight," he shouted, sprinting into the hallway. We followed him out, our hearts pounding with fear. There, between the 5th and 6th floors, sat the black cat, its red bow gleaming in the dim light. It stared at us with its cold, emotionless eyes, as still as a statue. Mark lunged at it before we could stop him. With a brutal kick, he sent the cat flying, its body hitting the wall with a sickening thud before rolling lifelessly down the stairs. For a moment, everything went silent. The oppressive air hung heavy. The flickering lights stopped blinking. There was nothing but darkness and stillness. Mark stood there, panting heavily, staring at the now motionless cat. His face twisted between anger and regret, his hands trembling. "It's dead. It's really dead," Mark muttered, as if trying to convince himself of what had just happened. I walked over to him, a deep sense of dread settling in my chest. The cat lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs, its red bow stark against its limp body. Its eyes, once sharp and haunting, were now lifeless. "How could you do that?" I whispered, disbelief lacing my voice. The cat had caused us so much unease, but I had never expected Mark to lash out so violently. Mark stood frozen, his hand gripping the stair railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His expression shifted from rage to confusion, as though he couldn't quite grasp what he had done. But the dead cat was undeniable proof of his actions. "It was watching me. It was controlling me," Mark said in a shaky voice, his fear palpable. James stepped up, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "You shouldn't have done that, man. It was just a cat." But deep down, we all knew that this cat wasn't just an ordinary animal. The next morning, the cat's body was gone. We searched the staircase, but there was no trace of it. No blood, no fur. It was as if the cat had vanished into thin air. Even James, usually the skeptical one, looked uneasy. "The body's gone, and so is the blood. How is that possible?" he muttered, rubbing his head in confusion. Tom and I examined the area, but nothing seemed out of place. It was as if the events of the previous night had never happened. "This can't be right. We saw it die," I said, a deep sense of unease settling over me. But things grew stranger still. Though the cat was gone, the eerie atmosphere in the apartment didn't lift. In fact, it grew worse. The air grew colder at night, and sometimes we felt an odd chill sweeping down from the 6th floor. While the cat's cries had stopped, the entire building seemed steeped in a dark, oppressive atmosphere. Mark's condition worsened. He became more isolated, barely speaking to us anymore. At times, we'd catch him talking to himself in his room, muttering incoherently. It seemed like something was deeply wrong with him, and we couldn't deny it any longer. The cat's death had unleashed something far worse. Just when things seemed like they couldn't get any stranger, a new tenant moved into the building. It was late in the afternoon when we saw her. We were just coming back from class, exhausted and ready to crash, when we noticed a girl standing at the door of the fourth-floor apartment. She was carrying a few bags, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, and she wore a long black dress that gave her an aura of mystery. Around her neck was a red ribbon, bright, strikingly similar to the bow the cat had worn. "Hey there," she said softly, giving us a smile that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't warm, it wasn't friendly. There was something cold and detached about it. "Are you new here?" James asked, trying to break the tension. "Yeah, I just moved in. My name's Sophia," she replied, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "Nice to meet you." We exchanged a few polite words before heading upstairs. But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. Her demeanor, her appearance, that red ribbon around her neck. It reminded me too much of the black cat. The timing of her arrival was far too coincidental, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. After Sophia moved in, Mark's condition deteriorated even further. He stopped speaking to us altogether, locking himself in his room most days. He looked gaunt and pale, as though the life was being drained from him. And the strangest part? He became obsessed with Sophia. At first, Mark would just run into her in the hallway. But soon, he started waiting for her, standing outside his door whenever she came back to the building. His face would light up in a way that was disturbing. He was captivated by her, as though he couldn't resist her presence. Even stranger, Sophia seemed to welcome his attention. Despite her cold, distant demeanor, she never rejected Mark. She often invited him into her apartment, and every time Mark returned from her place, he looked more tired, more drained. "Mark's been spending a lot of time with Sophia? Don't you think it's weird?" James asked me one night, his voice heavy with concern. I nodded. Something was definitely wrong. Since Sophia moved in, Mark's behavior had spiraled out of control. He had stopped going to class, stopped caring about anything except for Sophia. His eyes would glaze over when we mentioned her, as though she had some unspoken power over him. Even worse, every time Mark came back from Sophia's apartment, he looked worse. His skin paler, his eyes duller. It was as though being with her was sucking the life out of him. And no matter how much we tried to intervene, Mark refused to listen. "Sophia's just a girl. There's nothing wrong with her." Mark snapped at us one evening, his tone defensive. "Except every time you're with her, you come back looking like death," James pointed out, his frustration clear. Mark glared at us, retreating into his room without another word. Sophia's presence in the building was unsettling, to say the least. She always wore the same black dress, her long dark hair falling around her face. She seemed cold, detached from everything and everyone. Her red ribbon, it was always there, tied around her neck like a constant reminder of something sinister. I couldn't help but feel like Sophia wasn't just an ordinary person. There was something about her that defied explanation, and Mark, for whatever reason, had fallen under her spell. As the weeks passed, Mark's condition worsened. He became more and more isolated, and we barely saw him anymore. It was as though Sophia had taken complete control of his life. He spent almost every night at her apartment, only returning in the early hours of the morning, looking like a shell of his former self. The atmosphere in the building grew darker. Ever since the night the cat had died, a strange chill had settled over the place. The air was colder, and there were times when we'd hear strange noises coming from the 6th floor, low, groaning sounds that echoed through the empty hallway. Even though we had never been to the 6th floor, it felt like a forbidden place, always looming above us. That chained-off stairwell seemed to pull at us, especially late at night when the building was silent. "We need to figure out what's going on," I said one night, turning to James and Tom. "Sophia's presence. It's too weird, and Mark's getting worse. There's got to be something on the 6th floor." James nodded, his face lined with worry. "Yeah, but the 6th floor? What could be up there? We have no other choice. We can't just sit back and let Mark fall deeper into this." Tom hesitated but eventually nodded. I agree. There's something wrong with that place. We decided to break into the 6th floor that night to see if we could uncover whatever secrets it held. As much as we were afraid, we couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that Sophia's presence had brought. We had to find answers. It was late when we crept into the hallway. The building was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. The flickering lights barely illuminated the stairwell. We approached the chained-off stairwell, and James pulled out a set of tools to break the lock. After what felt like an eternity, the chain fell away with a soft clink. The door creaked open, revealing the stairs to the 6th floor. A foul, musty odor wafted down toward us, a mixture of mildew and decay. We shone our phone flashlights up the staircase, the light cutting through the thick layers of dust. The chill in the air grew stronger as we ascended, each step echoing in the silence. At the top of the stairs, we found a dusty old door covered in faded, tattered papers. What looked like old talismans, meant to ward off evil. They had yellowed with age, their protective power long since faded. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't answer. My gut told me that something was terribly wrong. I reached for the door and pushed it open, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside was a small attic room, filled with old furniture and clutter. The air was thick with the scent of mold and something far more sinister. In the corner of the room, I spotted a thick, worn notebook. It looked ancient, its cover yellowed and cracked with age. I picked it up and flipped through its pages, my heart racing as I realized what it was. "This is Bennett's journal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. James and Tom crowded around me, their curiosity piqued. We began reading, and the more we read, the more horrifying the truth became. The journal told the story of Bennett's daughter, Sophia, who had once lived in the apartment building. According to the entries, Sophia had a strange connection to a black cat. The journal described how she had some kind of dark, mysterious power, and the cat had been like her guardian, perhaps even a part of her soul. Sophia had died in a tragic accident, and the black cat had disappeared the same day. Bennett, desperate to cover up the incident, had sealed off the 6th floor, using the talismans to keep Sophia's vengeful spirit and the cat at bay. Sophia is dead. But if that's true, who have we been seeing? Tom's voice shook with fear. My heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. Sophia wasn't alive. She wasn't a real person. She was the black cat's reincarnated soul, a manifestation of whatever dark bond had tied them together. She had returned to the apartment, and Mark was her next target. "We have to stop her," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. Just as we prepared to leave the attic, we heard footsteps below, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the building. My stomach churned with dread as we realized someone, or something, was coming. We quickly shut the journal and turned toward the stairs. But before we could move, Sophia appeared at the bottom of the staircase. Her cold, empty eyes stared up at us, her face expressionless except for the eerie smile that curled at her lips. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly, her voice sending a shiver down my spine. We froze in place, fear gripping us. Sophia's presence felt like a dark cloud, suffocating us with the weight of her malevolent power. Mark's condition worsened by the day. Sophia had become his obsession, his only source of comfort, even as her influence drained him of life. He was losing himself, and no matter how hard we tried to intervene, Mark seemed intent on following Sophia down a path of destruction. Each night, Mark would disappear into Sophia's apartment, only to return hours later, looking weaker and more fragile. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, and his body was wasting away. It was as if Sophia was feeding off of him, draining him of everything that made him who he was. One night, James and I sat in the living room, discussing Mark's rapid decline. "Have you noticed how strange Sophia is? She doesn't seem human," James said, his brow furrowed with concern. I nodded. Everything about Sophia was off, her cold demeanor, her unchanging appearance. She always wore the same black dress, and the red ribbon around her neck was a constant reminder of the black cat. Sophia was a mystery we couldn't unravel, but Mark was falling deeper under her spell. You remember that black cat, right? I asked, recalling the night Mark had killed it. I think Sophia is the cat. James's eyes widened in disbelief, but as he thought about it, he slowly nodded. It makes sense. She showed up right after the cat died, and Mark's getting worse. We were both afraid to say it out loud, but we couldn't ignore the truth. Sophia wasn't a real person. She was the black cat, or at least the spirit of it. And somehow she had returned to exact some twisted form of revenge. As the days passed, Mark's health continued to deteriorate. His body was failing him, and his mind was slipping away. He spent most of his time staring blankly at the wall, barely responding when we tried to talk to him. Every night, we'd hear the low, eerie meowing again, as if the black cat had returned to torment us. I would look out the window at night, and there she'd be, Sophia, standing in the doorway, a black cat at her side. Her eyes gleamed with a cold, cruel light, and her smile was as chilling as ever. Sophia isn't human, I whispered to myself, the truth sinking in. She was something else, something dark and evil. She was the black cat spirit, using Mark's love and devotion to keep herself alive. The realization sent a wave of terror through me. Sophia had come back to life through Mark, and she was killing him slowly, using his life force to sustain her own existence. There was no other explanation. Mark's obsession with Sophia had consumed him, and she was leading him closer and closer to death. Everything came to a head on a stormy night. The wind howled outside the windows, and the rain battered against the glass. Lightning flickered across the sky, followed by rolling thunder. The entire apartment building seemed to shake with each clap of thunder, as if something terrible was about to happen. James and I were sitting in the living room, anxiously waiting for Mark to return. He had been missing all day, and we feared the worst. "We have to find him," James said, his voice tight with worry. He could be with Sophia. Just as we were about to head to her apartment, we heard a loud crash from upstairs. My heart leaped into my throat. Something was terribly wrong. We raced up the stairs, bursting into Sophia's apartment. There, standing on the edge of the balcony, was Mark. His eyes were vacant, his arms outstretched as if he were ready to fall into the void below. "Mark!" I shouted, trying to snap him out of it. Sophia stood behind him, watching us with a chilling smile. Her eyes were cold, and her presence radiated a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. "His time has come," she said softly, her voice filled with a sinister satisfaction. Mark's body wavered dangerously close to the edge. I rushed forward, trying to grab him, but Sophia stepped in my path. Her face twisted with rage, her eyes burning with fury. "You can't stop me," Sophia hissed. "He's mine." The air around us grew thick with cold, and Sophia's form began to waver, as though she was losing her grip on reality. Mark swayed on the edge, his face a mask of confusion and pain. "You can't control him," James shouted, darting forward to pull Mark away from the balcony. Sophia's body shuddered, and a look of fury crossed her face. The temperature in the room plummeted as she fought to maintain her hold on Mark. But it was too late. Her grip was weakening. Sophia's form began to blur, her figure fading away like smoke in the wind. "I could have stayed forever," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she vanished into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint echo of her presence. Sophia was gone. Her apartment was empty, and Mark collapsed on the floor, weak and trembling but alive. We searched the apartment, but there was no trace of Sophia. It was as if she had never existed. Her clothes were gone, her belongings disappeared. All that was left were a few black dresses and the red ribbon she had always worn. And the cat hair. The floor was covered in black cat hair, as if Sophia's true identity had finally been revealed. She hadn't been a woman at all. She had been the black cat all along. Mark, still in shock, asked weakly, "Is she really gone?" Even though we knew Sophia wasn't real, that she had been the cat's spirit, Mark was still haunted by her memory. Her disappearance left a void in his mind, a lingering obsession that wouldn't let him go. We tried to contact Bennett, hoping for answers, but he refused to speak about Sophia. He claimed there were no records of her ever living in the building, as if she had never existed. In the end, we left the apartment, taking with us the dark memories of what had happened. Sophia's presence lingered like a ghost, and no matter how much we tried to forget, we couldn't shake the fear she had instilled in us. The black cat, the red ribbon, the eerie smile. Sophia had vanished, but the terror she brought would stay with us forever. Thank you for watching. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Here's a question for you. Do you believe in soul reincarnation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.